Climate change seems to always be looming over us. We are frequently targeted with shocking headlines about terrifying natural disasters and predictions telling us that the planet won't have enough food for everyone in X amount of years. So what does climate change do to our natural systems? And how will it affect agriculture? Will we be able to feed all the people on this planet by the end of the century? In this video, I'm going to break down what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC's 5th Assessment Report, and some other scientific publications say about the impacts of climate change on the terrestrial biosphere and on agriculture. The IPCC is an institution of the United Nations which provides the member states' governments with objective and scientific information on the risks of climate change. First, we must understand how climate change affects the terrestrial biosphere, because different ecosystems react differently to the rising carbon levels and rising temperatures. When looking at the whole planet, we can see that climate zones have already shifted in many parts of the world. Dry climates have increased and polar climates decreased, and there's high confidence that bioclimatic zones will shift further as it gets hotter. On top of that, unprecedented climates will emerge, especially in the tropics. In satellite images, we can observe a greening trend in many parts of the world, which means that we can see more photosynthetic activity. This is called an increase in primary productivity. It happens in part because the growing season is getting longer, as winters are getting milder. But human land use also plays a part in this greening trend. While primary productivity is increasing in the higher latitudes, the positive effects are actually offset by deforestation in the tropics. Let's look at how this shift in climatic zones affects forests, for example. Forests act as carbon sinks for the planet. That means they extract carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the trees and soils. These sinks are becoming weaker as the rising temperatures, drought, and fires put the trees under stress. It is even possible that by the end of the century, our forests will emit more CO2 than they can take up. This would make them a carbon source, which would further accelerate climate change. Let's look at boreal forests. They are coniferous forests found at high latitudes and elevations. Many of them have experienced productivity declines already, which can be seen in satellite images, where parts of the forest look brown when compared to images from previous years. This phenomenon is called browning trends. As it gets warmer, boreal forests will also expand poleward into tundra regions. The term tundra refers to regions without trees due to cold temperatures. These will also experience a shift in species composition, with more temperate plant types entering the ecosystem. Now, let's move on to temperate forests. These are forests in the mid-latitudes. They too are beginning to show signs of climate stress. These signs range from increased tree mortality and more frequent fires to insect outbreaks and pathogen attacks. Especially in the last decade, extreme climate events had a major impact on temperate forests. Closer to the equator, we have the tropical forests. These forests could actually benefit from the additional CO2 in the atmosphere. The plants there could use it to increase photosynthesis and grow faster. However, rising air temperatures could counteract this effect. The scientific consensus is that many tree species in the tropics are especially sensitive to drought and fire, both of which are increasing with climate change. Especially for the Amazonian rainforest, there's a risk that climate change, together with human interference, will bring the system to a tipping point. If this happens, the Amazon forest dieback will transform the entire region to a savanna. The idea is that there is less and less rainfall in the Amazon because of deforestation. Fewer trees lead to decreased transpiration, therefore less air moisture. This would lead to a self-reinforcing transition where more trees die off, leading to even less rain until a new dry, stable state is reached. This would impact our global climate dramatically. In Africa and Australia, we are observing almost the opposite effect. There, forests are expanding into savannas. This occurs mostly in areas that used to be too cool for forests. In projections of future climate, There are future increases in rainfall expected for most, but not all savanna areas. And together with increased CO2, there is a higher likelihood of more trees and shrubs, and thereby increased woody biomass. Then, there are also grass and shrublands. In cool areas, they are expected to respond to warming with more plant growth, while those in hot areas are expected to show decreased production. Now, this change in landscapes does not come without additional costs. Whole ecosystems are changing rather abruptly. The consequence of this is very often biodiversity loss. Many plant and animal species have experienced changes in range size and location. But not only that, abundances are altered, and many species shift their seasonal activities. A common example are birds who start mating or nesting earlier and earlier, or plant species adapted to a mountain habitat that migrate upward chasing their climatic zone. But the higher up the mountain you get, the smaller the surface area becomes. Exactly this niche tracking is becoming especially hard for many species, since climate change is happening very quickly and many species have low dispersal capacities. They are eradicated by heat-related stresses or invasive species before they can move to an area more suitable to their needs. Additionally, most tropical species already currently exist near their temperature optimum and have nowhere to go. We actually know little about potential rangeless in common and widespread species. This is a serious concern, as even small declines in such species can significantly disrupt ecosystem structure, function, and services. We can say with certainty that the hotter the planet by the end of the century, the more biodiversity loss will occur. This being said, under the lowest projected rates, and with the assistance of effective conservation actions, the large majority of species will be able to adapt to new climates or move to places that improve their chances of survival. In 2013, a study by BOREAL et al. Compared biodiversity loss under a business as usual scenario of carbon emissions with two scenarios assuming emissions peaking in 2016 or 2030. They found that by 2080, more than half of the amphibians and almost 60% of plants would lose at least half of their range if we don't significantly reduce CO2 emissions. But even if emissions had peaked in 2016, only a bit over a quarter of amphibians would lose at least half of their range, and the numbers of plants look similar. This study clearly shows that even under the most optimistic scenarios, climate change's impact on biodiversity will be severe. This brings us to invasive species. Invasive species are usually species with high dispersal capacities, which can profit from climate change by invading new regions and outcompeting native species. Generally, they can move toward higher latitudes and higher elevations. The spread of species which are drought tolerant or are able to take advantage of higher temperatures will be the most visible. But it is important to note that a lot of these invasive species are actually deliberately or accidentally transported to their invasive ranges by people. When new species invade an ecosystem, they can alter processes such as fire regimes and water cycling, thereby not only affecting other species they are in direct competition with, but the entire ecosystem. In the last century, invasive plants contributed to desertification and loss of ecosystem services in many dryland areas. Plant species invasion often appears as greening and satellite images, but led to losses in economic productivity of affected areas. This is the case in Eastern Africa, for instance, where a shrub species from the Americas is taking up scarce water and killing native plants, but it is not edible to livestock. So, in summary, the IPCC says with very high confidence that species invasions have increased over the last several decades, and with high confidence that negative impacts on ecosystem services and biodiversity are increasing. But the impacts don't end there. It's not only individual species that are affected, or the ecosystems they thrive in, but also the very soil they live and grow on. This brings us to the process of land degradation. Land degradation can affect the soil, water, or biotic components of the land and the interactions between them. This is a problem for the climate because currently there's 10 times as much carbon stored in the soils than in forests. The IPCC says with high confidence that currently biomass and soil carbon stocks in terrestrial ecosystems are increasing, but that they are vulnerable. Rising temperatures and extreme events like drought and fire threaten to release the stocks into the atmosphere and further accelerate global warming. Land degradation can also be caused by changes in plant composition or woody encroachment, where shrubs and trees expand into previously grassland areas, like discussed earlier in the savanna example. Invasive species can also affect the soils, for instance by leading to shifts in the composition of organisms in the soil or by creating more surface for erosion to occur. On rangelands, selective grazing and its interaction with climate variability and/or fire can push ecosystems into new compositions. These pastures offer less food to the animals grazing on them, in part because of higher proportion of inedible invasive species. Another very important land degradation process is permafrost thawing. This has a massive impact on climate change because frozen soils are an enormous carbon sink. Permafrost soils are simply frozen wetlands. Wetlands actually cover only about 3% of the global land surface. However, they hold the equivalent of half the atmosphere's carbon as CO2, or 1/3 of the world's soil carbon stock. Wetlands are especially vulnerable to change through land use and climate change. They have already become a source of carbon because of human disturbances. 1/5 of the world's peatlands are being used for agriculture, and this number is expected to increase. Another land degradation process which is increasing is desertification. This most commonly happens in dryland areas. In some areas it has already reduced agricultural productivity and contributed to the loss of biodiversity. Desertification intensifies climate change through changes in vegetation cover, sand and dust aerosols, and greenhouse gas fluxes. Desertification and climate change individually already have negative impact on dryland ecosystem services and ecosystem health. In combination, these effects will be intensified and accelerated. Places which are already deserts today are expected to become warmer and drier at faster rates than other terrestrial regions. Some of the biological adaptations desert species have in order to survive the extreme climate may be outpaced by global climate change, and the species will no longer be able to tolerate the new conditions in their habitat. So, how do shifting ecosystems, biodiversity loss, and land degradation affect agriculture? And is agriculture affecting these processes in return? As far as climate forcing goes, agriculture is a major contributor. Between 2007 and 2016, agriculture was responsible for about 23% of human greenhouse gas emissions. This means that our food production is not only susceptible to climate change, it also drives it. We see the effects of climate change on crop and terrestrial food productions in regions all across the planet. Things like unusually hot nights, extremely high daytime temperatures, and changes in rainfall extremes are negatively affecting crop production. But there are also less visible effects, like an increased transmission risk for diseases. However, not all effects are negative. Many colder areas benefit from reduced frost damage. This being said, negative impacts of climate trends have been more common than positive ones. The IPCC has looked at many studies which try to quantify the projected impact on agriculture. A key finding is that in tropical and temperate regions, wheat, rice, and maize will suffer a decrease in production at 2 degrees warming or more without adaptation. This number, 2 degrees, comes from the Paris Agreement. In this, the members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have agreed to keep the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, but aiming for 1.5 degrees. Together with soybean, wheat, rice, and maize provide 2/3 of human caloric intake. And after 2050, the risk of more severe impacts increases. A concerning trend is increasing food price instability. In the time frame between the IPCC's 2 last assessment reports, there have been several periods of rapid food and cereal price increases. They had been caused by climate extremes in key producing regions. The IPCC states with high confidence that crop yields are very sensitive to extreme daytime temperatures around 30 degrees. Temperatures which are just too hot reduce the yield significantly. Studies have shown this for many crop species and regions. They also found that this sensitivity exists throughout the growing season. Let's look at how cropping plants respond physiologically to higher temperatures. Higher mean temperatures shorten the growth cycle and the plants mature faster. When it's really hot during flowering, they have fewer grains per ear. Studies looking at wheat found that when it's really hot after flowering, seeds mature earlier and faster. And, of course, all plants experience increased water stress at high temperatures. In the second half of the 20th century, drought and extreme heat substantially damaged national agricultural production across the globe. Droughts reduced cereal yield and completely damaged crops, while extreme heat lowered yields. For some, maybe counterintuitively, developed nations suffer most from these extreme weather damages. Some reasons for this are that, for one, in developed nations, agriculture heavily depends on monocultures and little crop diversity. And developing nations generally have more smallholders who tend to use risk minimizing strategies as opposed to yield maximization strategies. Predicting how crop yields will be affected by climate change in the future is tricky, especially at smaller scales like when looking at individual countries. The projected precipitation is an important factor in estimating yields. In general, projected impacts vary across crops and regions, and adaptation scenarios. And these projections carry lots of uncertainties. We don't have a good understanding of how prolonged periods beyond the optimal temperatures impact our crops. The IPCC reports a slight positive response of global crop productivity up to 1.5 degrees warming for wheat and maize. But after that, global crop productivity will definitely be negatively affected. These graphs from the IPCC report on food security and food production systems combine the results of 66 yield impact studies for wheat, maize, and rice. The red lines indicate studies that assume no adaptation measures will be taken, whereas the blue ones account for some adaptation. The dots indicate a known change in CO2. The remaining data points are marked with X's. Here we are looking at the projected changes in rice yields. We see that in temperate and tropical regions, yields are expected to decrease without adaptation. With adaptation, it could be possible for tropical rice production to continuously increase their yields up to 5 degrees of global warming. In this next graph, we are looking at the projected impacts on wheat yields. Again, we see yields declining in temperate and tropical regions when no adaptation measures are taken. This is already true at 1 degree warming. In the tropics, even with adaptation, massive yield losses at over 30% at 5 degrees warming are expected. In temperate regions, with adaptation, there could be yield increases even up to such high temperatures. Similarly, as you can see in this graph on the yields of maize, corn production would decrease in both regions without adaptation. In temperate regions, there could be a slight increase with adaptation all the way up to 5 degrees. So this data confirms that even slight warming will decrease yields in low latitude regions. There are overall more decreases than increases at all temperatures. Plants also have a physiological response to carbon dioxide. With more CO2 in the atmosphere, most plant species improve their water use efficiency and increase yields. While this effect might seem positive at first, there are actually downsides to this. Increased atmospheric carbon has negative impacts on the nutritional value of many crops. Cereals and potatoes have shown decrease in protein and mineral content. Especially decrease of protein is a serious concern. In the edible portions of wheat, rice, barley, and potato, studies have found protein decreases between 10 and 14%. The content of minerals and trace elements, which are essential for human health, also decreases with elevated CO2 levels. Elements like iron and calcium decline by 2.5 to 20% in wheat grain. Similar effects have also been found in barley. However, elevated CO2 levels can also increase yields, which might increase the overall yield of minerals. And the changes in mineral concentration because of CO2 occur within a complex system. There are many other factors influencing the mineral concentration, like the crop species, the soil type, what type of tissue the plant grows, and how much water is available when during the growth cycle. But carbon does not only affect our crops. Invasive weeds will also benefit from changes in climate and CO2 concentration. As discussed before, they can spread to new areas, but they can also increase their competitiveness because of the elevated carbon. But besides carbon, there are also increases of other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere which can affect plant growth. We know that elevated tropospheric ozone, or O3, also has damaging effects on crop yields. And still, this is not the end of it all. Climate change will likely increase the frequency and severity of animal pests and pathogens in crops. Compared to weeds, the potential loss is still lower, but a worldwide average yield loss for major crop species because of pests and pathogens is estimated between 15 and 20%. These numbers assume no measures to protect from these pests have been taken. Overall, our ability to predict the impacts of CO2 and climate change on pathogen biology and how it affects yields is limited. That is because we have no experimental data, and the analyses that exist focus on individual diseases rather than the complete set of important diseases. But agriculture goes beyond just crops. So how do the animals fare with all these changes? Unfortunately, when looking at livestock, the effects of climate change have not been studied as much. We know that transmission risk for diseases increases with climate change. One of these diseases is the blue tongue virus, which attacks ruminants like cows. Other than that, ticks that carry zoonotic diseases have also likely changed distribution, but the pastures on which livestock graze aren't spared from the negative impacts of climate change either. Increased carbon and changes in precipitation affect pasture quality and quantity. This, of course, affects the animal's health and productivity. We are already observing issues such as overgrazing, land degradation, and conflicts in the access to pasture land. These conflicts are likely to increase as access to water and feed becomes more difficult. For 2 degrees warming, a worldwide loss of up to 10% of livestock depending on rangeland is projected. With all these facts, the question arises, how did we find them? And the truth is that there are many different experiments in the field and in laboratories with many different findings. No study can really account for all the conditions which the future might hold. We can combine knowledge we gain from many different types of analyses to get closer to what we expect the future to be like. But one of the main issues is that we don't have a clear baseline. We don't have comparable scientific experiments at a large enough scale in the absence of climate change. Another difficulty is that models which predict future yields and yield quality assume farming practices and technologies don't adjust in response to climate change. Likewise, models are not good at quantifying the impacts of rare but very extreme events on cropping systems. Another interesting aspect is that so far, crop modeling studies have looked at much shorter timescales than those used in climate research. They also tend to look at small spatial scales, like individual sites or provinces. This makes it hard to scale up the results to the scale at which the effects of climate change occur. Climate change is a gradual process, and the impacts are very different across regions of this planet and across seasons. This makes it hard to quantify the effects in easy-to-grasp numbers. But what the research can, without a doubt, show us is that climate change will put our natural and agricultural systems under enormous stress. Negative impacts will likely outweigh the positives, especially in regions which are already rather hot. This is already true at the 1.5-degree target, which we are most likely going to miss. The hotter the planet gets, the worse the impacts will be. So it is in our best interest to keep global warming as low as possible. This is called mitigation. Besides mitigation of climate change, we do have one last option for agriculture: adaptation. We can improve the outcome if we diversify our crops, irrigate much more effectively, and manage our fertilizer better. We can rehabilitate degraded lands and change our agricultural systems away from monocultures. One promising approach is agroforestry, where forested lands are not only used to store carbon and produce timber, but also for crops and livestock grazing. Speaking of livestock, we can change our meat consumption patterns and explore insect alternatives. These adaptation strategies are a selection of those already being explored. In combination with effective mitigation, they will allow us to dampen the negative impacts of global warming and might even allow us to increase production and ecosystem health in some areas. So to come back to our question from the beginning, will we be able to feed all the people on this planet by the end of the century? The answer is unfortunately not very straightforward. It all depends on how much warming will occur, how many people will live on this planet, their dietary habits, and how we adapt our agricultural systems. All of this is unclear right now, and we should be alarmed about the current development of climate change. Because our natural and agricultural systems are already suffering from the effects of climate change, and we are not on our way to meet the 1.5 degree or 2 degree target,